Welcome to Employee Termination Tips. My name is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal. And in this particular video, we're going to be looking at probably one of the most overlooked aspects for Canadian employees who've lost their job, whether it's by firing or termination. And it is something that for whatever reason seems to be consistently overlooked, even by legal counsel representing fired employees in Canada. And part of this is because it's an aspect that's more prevalent outside of the province of Ontario. So you're going to see this happen actually more in provinces like Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and elsewhere. And what is that? It's payroll. And payroll is extremely problematic, and it results in underpayments during the course of one's employment all too often. And that is because payroll systems were designed not to pursue optimal employee payments, not to ensure that the law is specifically being followed as it relates to the employees. But what appears to be the prominent focus of payroll practices and payroll software is to make sure that there is compliance with respect to payroll taxes, so the government is properly getting its due and the employer is satisfied that payroll taxes have been paid. So that is what appears to be the primary emphasis of payroll systems, payroll staffs, and payroll software. And this can be tracked back to where it emanates from. And a lot of payroll software emanates from the United States, moves over to Ontario, and then moves over to the other provinces. And similarly, a lot of the training with respect to payroll staff emanates out of Ontario and then moves into the other provinces, whether it's Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, or the Maritime provinces. But what is happening is that the focus is on aspects of payroll tax in the processing. And this is not really of greatest concern to the employee at the end of the day. It's of great concern to the employer. What the concern for the employee is that their pay has been fully paid. And this is the weakness. And in fact, when it comes to employee pay, the problem is that when you look at how the payroll software is designed, and even the payroll systems are designed, they're designed for simplicity and not for compliance with legal practices. So much of the appearance that it's a payroll software that's designed to be compliant with the various provinces, and we've done that, that's on the payroll tax side. All too often, what appears to be the case with respect to the other aspects of payroll, which is employee pay and the calculation of pay, overtime, vacation pay, general holiday pay, otherwise known as statutory holiday pay, and all other aspects of your pay arrangement, those are outside of the ambit of the payroll software. Typically, it has to be done by procedures that fall upon the payroll staff. And this creates its own set of issues because they're not apparently properly trained, or they're relying too much upon the software, and the employers are not looking to try to find and make sure that it's correcting the issues they have in it. The lawyers don't get involved, the accountants don't get involved, because the lawyers and accountants were properly involved, the calculations would all too often be correct as opposed to underpayments. And that is where you're getting the issues. Because the payroll software the payroll training is sort of designed off of the basis of a U.S. system. And a U.S. system is not statutory based because they don't really have the kind of employment standards legislation that we have. It's more of a contractual basis, which is dictated by the employer. In Canada, however, we have a statutory basis of minimums that is far more complicated, and the complexity is especially complex outside of Ontario. And it's employment standards legislation that makes requirements. Those requirements are very specific as to what has to be done. But if you don't know what they are, you don't understand them, you don't deal with them accordingly, what happens is you can find yourself getting underpaid as an employee. And that is because the employers are not out there looking to find out where they're underpaying. No, they're trying to cut costs, not increase costs. And if nobody raises it to their attention, they're not going to do anything about it. They're just going to proceed. Nobody talks about it apparently. Nobody understands complexities. They see complex pay statements at times with lots of information, lots of data coming in. Just because there's lots of data doesn't mean it's correct. Similarly, there's minimal data in there. The fact that there's minimal data in there, it's hard to discern what's missing unless you really know what it is. And clearly the lawyers are not getting involved in this. The lawyers are involved in the transactional side, the big projects. They're not there coming in and saying, even the accountants aren't, please scrutinize my pay system to find out how I'm underpaying my employees. That is not what employers do. Employers are constantly trying to cut costs, minimize costs, and they feel that their employees are getting overpaid as it is. They should be happy with what they're getting. So they're not going and scrutinizing the stuff. They don't want to. Because if they did, all too often they might very well realize they're underpaying. It creates mega problems for them. Because it's not just about underpaying one person, it's about underpaying their entire employee base. They can go back years. And there's so many more problems that arise from it. But the employers are not looking into this. And unfortunately, the employees seem to be too focused, and their lawyers seem to be too focused on the termination pay and severance pay alone, that they fail to address the aspects of payroll and the money that they've already are entitled to and they've earned by law. And this is the critical thing. The statute says you are owed this money. This is what the calculation was supposed to be. This is what the numbers are supposed to be. And you can't get away from it. But too many employees, when they lose their job, whether they're fired, terminated, dismissed, even when they quit, they walk away from money that they've earned, they're entitled to, and the law requires to be paid to them. But if you don't address it, you don't raise it, you don't deal with it, you're leaving that money on the table. Even though it's your money, it's left, it's lost, something you shouldn't be doing. And as I say, the problem is in part the fact that the payroll systems, the payroll calculations, they're very different from province to province, and they're especially different as compared to the states. And so much of this emanates from the United States, especially the software. But then beyond that, so much of it, the practices emanate from Ontario. And Ontario has some very nuanced aspects that make it very close to the US. They have some very distinct exclusions. They specifically exclude stuff from being calculated. That's a choice in Ontario. That's a choice that the legislature made. It's clear and it's set out. But simply because it's in Ontario and it's not in other provinces, doesn't mean it's so in those other provinces. Just because it says one thing on Ontario, if it says something different in Alberta, and you work in Alberta, you have to be paid in accordance with the laws of Alberta. You don't get paid in accordance with the laws of another province. If that was the case, why not just have one law, the easiest law for employers, and not be at the end of it? And that's not the case. And that's not how things work. You have one set of laws that applies to you in one province. And you can't pick and choose the laws that you want to apply. You have to use the laws in the province within which you're working. And that's how it works. But for some reason, employers seem to be all too often not doing that. Their focus is on their payroll taxes and not on the employee pay. And the employers aren't picking it up. The lawyers aren't picking it up. Well, the employers are not wanting their lawyers to find the mistakes that they're making because it's going to cost them money. But for whatever reason, a lot of the employee lawyers are not looking into this either. By not looking at this, they're just focused on their standardized practices. And even those You look at these demand letters that are coming out from lawyers in other provinces that are being submitted to legal counsel for the employer, and it looks like it's a template out of Ontario. And why is it a template for Ontario when they're not even in Ontario? And why are they so focused simply on termination and pay in lieu of notice and severance pay, when there's a more critical aspect, which is outstanding earned money that was paid during the course of one's employment, that's legally entitled to, that's on the books, can be easily calculated if you actually know what the calculations are and what you're looking for, and you pull the information up. That's what you're going to be focusing on. Or at least you got to be doing it in conjunction with the other stuff. You can't just leave it aside. At the end of the day, you can't be overlooking this. You cannot be overlooking it because it is money that has been earned by those employees. And as I said, especially those employees outside of Ontario, being employees in Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the Maritime provinces, quite possibly even Quebec. But like we're seeing it right now, over and over and over again in Alberta, it is absolutely ridiculous as to the non-compliance with the Employment Standards Code of Alberta. That's a law. That's a system how the payroll software should be done, the payroll staff should be calculating stuff, so on and so forth. But instead, what do I see? I see New Jersey blue laws are being technically applied. Or I'm seeing calculations done on Ontario Employment Standards Act. That's not what we're supposed to be dealing with. Wrong province, wrong country, whatever you want to say. If somebody's working in Alberta, it's the Alberta Employment Standards Code and the Employment Standards Regulations specific to the province of Alberta. And the same goes across Canada. It even goes to the federal level. If you are a company that's working under the Canada Labour Code, doesn't matter what province you're in, if you fall into that classification, if your business is subject to the Canada Labour Code, meaning it's like some business that operates across multiple provinces in a way that requires a single uniform application of employment standards legislation, or just the classification of the business itself requires such, you got to be following the federal law with respect to employment standards legislation, being the Canada Labour Code. And simply because you're in Ontario and your employer thinks the Employment Standards Act of Ontario is more preferable, yeah, it is, because you underpay your employees. And legally, if they're a provincial employee, they're not subject to Canada Labour Code, that's permitted. But if they're not, and if they're subject to Canada Labour Code, they got to be paid according to the Labour Code. And this can mean significantly higher payments due. Same thing applies to Alberta employees. You got to apply, if you're working in Alberta, you got to be working under the Alberta Employment Standards Code. Or if it's subject to the Canada Labour Code and you're working in Alberta, it's Canada Labour Code for making the calculations. That's the end of it. And the fact of the matter is, when you lose your job, when you're terminated, fired, or otherwise dismissed, you can't just simply get up and go and walk away from it. This is money that's owed to you. It's your money. You earned it. You deserve it. The law requires it to be paid to you. So you should be collecting on it. You shouldn't be just collecting on your termination pay in lieu of notice and severance pay. No. That's your money also. But why are you just going to leave possibly, like honestly, tens of thousands, sometimes over $100,000 on the table because you didn't look into it? That's ridiculous. Payroll is a problem in Canada, and it's overlooked far too much, especially when people lose their jobs, because it's money that's earned, and it's money that has to be pursued, and because you've earned it, and you're legally entitled to it, and that's pretty much the end of the story. So there's something that you have to deal with. You need to get a lawyer who understands what I'm talking about. Well, myself naturally, but also other lawyers, especially if they're in other jurisdictions, who understand this whole concept, who take the time to understand what the calculations really are and where the underpayments are And what's being overlooked? Because it's significant money that you are potentially losing out on. And it's your money. So take the time, pursue it with the right legal counsel, and get the money that you were owed, because it's earned money and the law requires it to be paid to you in most of those circumstances. Thank you.